is Chris Janzer, another familiar face that we have had numerous times at our conference. We're very appreciative of him spending the time here. He's going to give us some updates connected to Michigan accountability. He is the Assistant Director of the Office of Educational Assessment and Accountability, and he oversees Michigan's K-12 accountability systems. He has carried out the development, design, and implementation of the index, the A to F, the parent dashboard. Basically, I would say he's anything accountability. And I will turn it over to Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Good morning, everyone. Almost said good afternoon, although it is almost afternoon. So let me see if I can also share my screen here. All right. And all right, are people able to see my screen okay?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I will have a disclaimer up front. I don't have any awesome memes like Andy used. Mine is going to be pretty short and sweet as well, though. And I think a lot of you probably have a good feel of where we are now, but I will spend some time talking about sort of where I am feeling we're going next with accountability. So as everyone knows, all states had their had an assessment waiver that was approved back in the spring. This included accountability for federal purposes. So we had no school index system that we ran using 2019-20 data, and that included everything with it. We did have like graduation rate data that we could have used in some of the school quality and student success data, so like the advanced coursework, that sort of stuff. We do have that data, but because there was no federal requirement for us to both calculate and report it, we weren't going to put that out there. Identifications were also waived, so we were actually on schedule to identify our second, I guess, cohort of CSI schools, and then we always identify new TSI schools every year, so comprehensive support and improvement and targeted support and improvement schools. Additional targeted supports identifications were also part of that waiver, but we weren't scheduled to identify those this fall. I believe the next cycle with that is in 22-23. They also waived or sort of forbade states from exiting existing CSI schools. It considered sort of the cohorts in the different states as being paused. So that's kind of why you didn't see any exits either. And then the reporting of accountability results, large chunks of that were also waived. Let me continue on to the identifications. I'm not going to read this off, but it's there for those of you that hadn't seen the approved waiver. This was a language that the feds used. I believe Andy mentioned this in his presentation, but the United States Department of Education, they are expecting all states to assess students in the spring, as well as run states' accountability systems. This, I guess the latest that we had heard that was October at a virtual meeting. And then they do have an addendum sort of thing that I will kind of talk through as well here in a few slides. The main thing that they had was the reporting of accountability results using 2021 data, as well as identifying those targeted support and improvement schools. So they were pretty adamant about that. And again, that's sort of as of October. We'll see if that changes with the new administration. So we are still doing the annual education report, the AER. Most of that was waived in the waiver from spring. And I just have a list of all of the components of that were waived. So again, it's almost all of the, well, all of the assessment data and almost all of the accountability data. We do still have to report graduation rates. However, if you're familiar with the AER, the graduation rates on this one will be from the 18-19 school year. Also included in this sort of mini AER this year will be the civil rights data collection. I believe we have like a download file for that. And then teacher qualification data from the rep. Again, that wasn't really impacted by the tail end of the 1920 school year, but that will be part of it. Per pupil expenditures are also part of it. And then that will be available next week already. Geez, it'll be December 2nd, next Wednesday, I believe that is. We'll have it in the new My School data for schools and districts to access. You'll have to log in to get to the preview, but it will be there for a couple of weeks before we make that public. For those of you that actually have responsibilities with that, the deadline that MDE put in for publishing that on your own websites, I believe is February 15th. So there's quite a bit of time to do that. The other thing that I'll note about this is that on the new My School data, if you haven't played around with it yet, I've done a little bit. To get to it easily, if you go to the K-12 menu, it's under the accountability menu now. So that's changed a little bit from the old site where it was sort of its own thing. So regarding state accountability, for those of you that were paying attention, you'll know that we did release the A to F grades using the data that we had from 1920 back in very late October, and it was public in November. This was something that it wasn't included in any executive order, and after repeated attempts to communicate, this requirement was still active with both the governor's office and the legislature. We basically got crickets, so we ran it with what we had and released it. Again, it's very limited. We have old graduation rates. We do have WETA results from 1920. And we had, it was the last week that got chopped off when we really started seeing school districts close. But most of that data is there. I believe we had 95% of it. We also used chronic absenteeism data from the last school year up through March 13th, I believe. And then if you have an alternative school in your district, they just had to assure that they were complying with law. So yeah, that was public during election week. So not, again, we had, I don't think we had any external questions about that. The few questions we got were from schools and districts. Continuing on with state reporting, we are still updating the parent dashboard with data that we have. So obviously we're not updating student proficiency and growth, but we do have, again, like educator data. I believe qualified teachers should be getting updated shortly, as well as years of experience, that sort of stuff. And there had been a few updates made over the summer as well with data. School services and offerings, I'll plug that. We continue to update that. We've got about 50% of our schools participating in that. It is voluntary, but it is something that when we did parent focus groups, they indicated that that was valuable information to them. So check to see if you are not doing it. I urge you to participate in that. And if you are doing it, just make sure that you keep that information up to date. We pull it, or SEPI polls it 3 times a year. And I believe the next poll will be sometime in December. So that will be coming up soon. And then with anything that we're pushing through My School data from the 1920 school year, we are putting appropriate messaging around the data or the lack of data. I know the assessment reports had some brief messaging around why you couldn't get 1920 data. So we'll be doing that as well. we have language for the AER. We had some language on the school grades report as well. So what is next? I'm going to look at my chat here real quick. I think I have to stop sharing for that. Yeah. Oh, okay. So asking questions of Andy. Okay, I will go back to my slideshow then. Okay, so what's next? So Andy kind of hit on this as well. We have an addendum that really just covers accountability for the 2020-21 school year. USAID communicated this to states in mid to late October. They're expecting any submissions from states on February 1st or by February 1st. So that's a little early for us to know quite what the impact will be on assessment data. So right now we are seeking tweaks to 2 items basically. So we're looking for another delay in identifying CSI schools. So that would push the identification to fall 22 based on 21-22 data. And potentially also pushing back additional targeted support schools. That one we have to discuss a little bit more just because that has a longer or a bigger frequency for identification. And I mentioned that one isn't due until, or we don't identify again until 22-23. So we can ask for it. We're not sure, again, if we'll need it. That's sort of the caveat with having to submit this by February 1st. We just don't know the impact without data. We're also considering submitting modified CSI exit criteria based on 2021 data. And this is for existing CSI schools that would potentially have been exited this fall. We're investigating whether or not we can use basically non-state assessment data for this. This could potentially relieve some pressure for then when we do have to do identifications again by getting some of the schools that have shown progress over the last few years sort of off of the CSI cohort. So that's the addendum. And it's really, the way that USAID is selling this is that the addendum is for temporary tweaks only for the 2021 school year. If you've seen a copy of the addendum, you'll see it really covers all aspects of states' accountability systems, and a lot of the remaining part of the addendum doesn't really apply to us because of the way our accountability system was designed. So the feds are looking to give flexibility around weights for the different indicators in states' accountability systems. However, ours is already flexible with that. So, you know, if you're not a high school, we reallocate the weight for the graduation rate to existing indicators. We don't rely on multi-year averages anymore. The growth model does look at multiple years of information, but we don't do any averaging of that. And then currently we're thinking participation can largely be handled through the students not tested process. However, we do need to deliberate on that a bit more. I know some of my counterparts in other states have talked about that as well, but the feeling is that a better insurance policy might be asking for a waiver as well. And I know Andy had indicated that as well. So participation in state assessments. However, there are some unintended consequences with that as well. So we're being careful about that right now, but that is a potential issue that we would address, probably not through an addendum, but like a waiver. So what we will also be doing after the spring, and I'm assuming we'll have some sort of assessment data, is submitting an amendment for the ESSA plan, which covers permanent changes to the accountability system in our case here, but states can also submit amendments for whatever else is covered by their ESSA plan. So at a minimum, we have to reset the long-term goals or the targets used in the index because as you probably know, the existing targets are tied to the previous top 10 and 10 strategic plan. And so that's something that we're going to have to recalculate. Whether we tie it to the new top 10 strategic plan or something else remains to be seen. But that is something that we'll be looking at changing at some point in 2021. And as always, we would need data to determine both that and other potential changes. I could actually see us doing some sort of a temporary reset to the targets. And then once we have more stability in the assessment data, doing another reset of accountability targets after 2 or 3 years. I don't know yet. I don't really have good answers until I have my hands on data. Other potential changes, I mentioned the participation thing. We could seek not necessarily an amendment to the participation requirement, but a waiver for it, at least temporarily. We are keeping a close eye on the growth model as well. So at a minimum, assuming that we do have assessments in the spring, we should be able to run the growth model, but we won't have growth for 4th graders for the M-STEP test, and we won't have growth for 1st graders in WIDA because those kids never tested last spring. Waiver-wise, we've been talking about a broad sort of waive assessments and the accountability system. Andy had talked about this, sort of just a simple, kind of like what happened last spring. So a broad waiver versus something more targeted, where again, we like narrow in and focus on the participation rate requirement, as well as the multiplier that we use. So remember, one of the requirements in ESSA was that the performance measures have to account for the 95% participation rate as well. And so in Michigan, we multiply proficiency and growth by that if the participation rate is below 95%. So that might be something that we look at trying to waive, at least temporarily. I think that's all I had. I'm going to stop sharing here a second because I think I saw some chat stuff. Let's see, Emily, analysis behind why WIDA results were decided to be included, be shared with us. So it was really a simple decision because the law was not waived. We had to include what we had. Not all students were assessed who were missing. Again, we were around 95%. I don't know if we're sharing anything beyond what was already shared through the secure site. And I don't know if Andy wants to jump in here on that, but I don't believe there were plans to share statewide WIDA results. And that was pretty much all I had for this. So the next couple of months, we'll be working on that addendum. So we'll have a little bit, you should see us submitting for the delay in identification. We'll start working on what we think we'll need to tweak for an amendment permanently, but the bulk of that work probably won't really start up until later in the spring. Are there any questions? Oh, I should say, for submitting a waiver, states are allowed to submit waivers at any point. Same with amendments, although USED did indicate that they were looking to have amendments submitted on February 1st as well, which is kind of odd. We actually submitted feedback to them late last week saying that the February 1st due date for those submissions didn't work for Michigan and probably didn't work for most of the other states, just the way that assessment windows are scheduled.
We'll give it another minute or so to see if anybody else has any questions for the chat. It looks like we're pretty good to go. So thank you very much, Chris. We appreciate you coming and sharing the updates, and are kind of anxious to see where we end up in the spring and next year with all this
Yeah.
uncertainty.
Definitely me as well. Hopefully we'll know more as we get closer to the assessment window, for sure.
Okay. Well, thank you again for coming, and hopefully we can offer you the chicken dinner next year, or the sandwiches or something at the Bavarian Inn.
Looks like Stan had a last minute question, just confirming the school grades use the 2018-19 graduation rates. That is correct. Yes, those were lagged, just like if we had done them in the school index. So you'll see 19-20 graduation rates. Again, the U.S. Department of Ed, their expectation is that we run accountability for 2021, and that would use 19-20 graduation rates. And they specifically talked about that in October, that the graduation rate calculations were not part of the waivers.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We appreciate your time. So I'm going to move into the next item on the agenda, and I'm going to hand it over to Jim Gullen. He wanted to give us an update, if you weren't here yesterday, about an opportunity that MAC has.
Thanks, Kathy. Let's see. See if I can. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Kathy. And let me put a registration link in the chat. If you're interested, the Assessment Learning Network on December 3rd has Doug Fisher coming in virtually to talk about best classroom summative assessment methods and strategies in a virtual environment. And this is open to anyone that's interested. So if you are, feel free to move on over to the Michigan Assessment Consortium website and take a look. And we hope to see many of you there. Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks. Thanks, Jim. And we know that that'll be an excellent opportunity for people. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so we're moving into the last item on our agenda, which is getting some feedback for day 2. We do look at the evaluations and the feedback that you give, which helps us design the next conference. We don't have a spring conference date. We will get that out to you. I think we were trying to kind of see how things fell out a little bit, so we know we're very timely in what we present. So if you would please complete the bit.ly day 2 feedback link there, we would appreciate it. And I believe we're going to also put in the chat box yesterday's link, just so if you didn't have an opportunity to complete that and you were here yesterday, that you would do so. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and adjourn our conference. If you're a MERA board member, if you could please stay on for a moment. And we have just a couple minutes, so please take that 5 minutes to complete the evaluations for us. And thank you. And goodbye. Have a good Thanksgiving.